Two of the most recognizable voices of the 1960s were these two, electric, rebellious, and doomed to burn out too soon. They were legends on stage. The plot takes a terrible turn off stage. Janis Joplin's wildness, boldness, and unabashed individuality were well known. However, most people are unaware that she had a strong dislike for Jim Morrison, a rock star, and for good cause. It was something far more troubling than a simple ego clash that led to their heated first encounter. It was partially remembered, discussed in whispers, and written off as rock and roll mayhem for decades. However, a troubling new dimension has emerged that alters what we previously believed to be true about these two icons. Hold on tight, for what follows is not only startling, but also memorable. Cruel beginnings. Janis Lynn Joplin was born in Port Arthur, Texas, where there was a strong tradition, conformity was expected, and anyone who didn't fit in may be expelled. Janis was clearly herself. She wasn't merely different. She shone a streak of audacity early on, favoring music, poetry, and art that were different from what young Southern ladies were supposed to like. Janis was listening to African-American blues musicians, Bessie Smith, May Rainey, and Leadbelly, who sang of suffering, injustice, and desire in a way that spoke directly to her soul, while other children were listening to mainstream or country music. However, Port Arthur not only misinterpreted Janis, it made a concerted effort to shatter her. She was cruelly made fun of for her appearance in school. Her weight fluctuations, acne, and tomboy attire all served as easy targets for peers who took pleasure in making her feel inferior. Furthermore, it was not only teasing, rather it was the type of focused, long-lasting psychological bullying. The fact that Janis dared to stand up for her beliefs just made things worse. She publicly advocated for racial integration in a community in the South that was extremely segregated. She became a lightning rod for derision as a result. Lamar State College of Technology and the University of Texas at Austin were the first two institutions she looked to in the hopes of finding some solace. Maybe here, instead of being pitied for her disabilities, she would finally be appreciated for her skill. That assumption is incorrect though. Austin carried the same malice that had caused Janis's suffering in the past. She gradually gained a notoriety for being rushed barefoot in men's clothing while holding an auto harp at coffee shops, and she was unable to escape the ominous shadow of criticism. Members of a UT fraternity voted her the ugliest man on campus in a display of unimaginable cruelty. Janis's soul was permanently burned by the scorching pain of being mocked, misinterpreted, and expelled. However, in an odd turn of events, they became the fuel for her music. She didn't hold anything back as she sang. She shouted, sobbed, scraped, and shook as she spoke. Nothing but the unadulterated statement of someone who has experienced the rejection of the world profoundly and turned it into a strong will. She sang about more than just the blues, she made them appear. She didn't make technical or pleasant music. Those who were familiar with what it was like to be an outsider found resonance in the naked truth. Her whole career, in a sense, became a vehicle for her to confront anybody who had tried to harm her and to publicly declare her identity, voice, and worth. However, when the agony followed her into adulthood, Janis turned to something else for solace, even though it would end up being both a blessing and a curse. Comfort in the South. Southern comfort meant more than simply a drink to Janis Joplin. It resembled her theatrical demeanor, almost exactly. Janis, who often strolled on stage with a bottle of SoCo, as if it were a microphone, was known for her bohemian style, her large rose-tinted spectacles, and her raspy voice that could break hearts. Whether she was playing in a smoke-filled bar or in front of thousands at Woodstock, it made no difference. That bottle wasn't only for show, it was a part of the performance. During sets, she occasionally took a sip in between songs. She allowed it to relax her anxieties and release the unfiltered emotion she poured into each wail. She didn't drink it with a connoisseur's grace. She drank it as openly and unrepentantly as she lived. Like Janis, the drink itself was a little unclear. The majority of people, including Janis, believed that Southern comfort was whiskey. However, it isn't always the case legally. For a large portion of its existence, Southern comfort was a flavored liqueur made from neutral grain spirits that were more akin to vodka than bourbon. Backstage, on tour buses, or casually carried under one arm at press engagements, She was frequently spotted carrying a bottle. Journalists and fans took notice. When Soko joined her brand, the brand noticed. The creators of Southern Comfort looked to Janis Joplin, the unintentional marketing treasure trove. But without getting paid a dime, she rose to prominence as their most recognizable and defiant spokesperson. As a thank you gift, the current bullion looked for her a full-length lynx fur coat and matching cap. Such a bold gesture was a status signal in the late 1960s, not merely a fashion statement. Janis wore it with pride, saying she never felt gorgeous. However, Southern Comfort was both a boon and a bane, much like many of the symbols that shaped Janis's existence. Her limits would be blurred by the same wine that gave her courage before she took the stage. She had more than just a theatrical connection to drinking. They were intricately entwined with her anguish, her fears, and the strain of being famous. When she didn't feel exactly enough, it numbed her. When the world grew chilly, it kept her warm. And ultimately, they all had a part in her premature demise due to the influence of several drinks. Just 27 years old. Lost loves and heartbreaks. The world viewed Janis Joplin as a free-spirited wild counterculture icon, but her romantic life was sometimes a picture of silent anguish. She had a strong need for both love and artistic expression, but she hardly ever found both together. Her relationships were frequently tumultuous and short-lived. Disappointing ashes were left behind by flash flames. With the same raw enthusiasm she brought to the stage, she plunged herself into relationships. And she was the one left alone the most of the time. Although some couldn't manage her passion, some lovers appreciated her intelligence. Her celebrity drew more people than her spirit. She often opened out only to be met with treachery, silence, or apathy. Her brief meeting with singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen in the Chelsea Hotel in New York in 1968 is likely the most emotionally impactful instance in this respect. Later, Cohen mentioned the encounter in the well-known Chelsea Hotel number, although he did it with artistic detachment. For Janis, what had appeared like a negligible fleeting moment seemed to carry an almost terrible weight. She could have been searching for Chris Christopherson that evening, but she ended up with whoever was available, which appears to cast a gloomy shadow over the entire situation. Cohen realizes many years later that he wasn't really sure how he felt about identifying Janis in that song. Whatever had been merely art to him had probably been something far more personal to her, but he discovered this too late. Like a lot of previous romantic evenings, that one ended in disappointment. Not only did those love disappointments affect her personal life, but they also influenced her music. Perhaps Piece of My Heart, Cry Baby, weren't simply songs, they were confessions brimming with the strange anguish that comes when love drains you from the inside out. Her calling card was that extremely painful vulnerability, intensely human, flawed, and painfully honest. Her voice was able to fly through the hearts of many others who had experienced the same agony of rejection because of it. And that fervent need for love. Janis Joplin reminded us in each song that underneath the fire, the fur coat, and the celebrity was a Texas girl who yearned to be hugged and never really accepted that her stardom had shattered her. Janis Joplin was never supposed to be fixed by fame. What was already broken was just made worse. Janis had started battling substance abuse long before anyone knew her name, frequently using amphetamines and booze to numb her inner agony. However, her reliance increased as she made her national debut, first with Big Brother and the Holding Company and then as a solo performer. In particular, heroin took center stage in her life. The loneliness and self-doubt that had plagued her since childhood intensified, perhaps in spite of or possibly as a result of her meteoric success. Her loved ones looked on helplessly. Off stage, the girl who could electrify a throng of thousands grew more and more alone. The party lifestyle that had previously given her a sense of power now started to erode her, and friendships fell apart due to her unpredictable conduct. Janis made many attempts at recovery, even leaving the San Francisco scene in the middle of the 1960s to go back to her Texas homeland in the hopes of sobriety. However, the allure of music and the associated way of life was too great. She swiftly rekindled old behaviors after returning to California and re-entering the spotlight. There were brief moments of optimism and clarity, but they were brief. She was recording Pearl, her most well-known solo album, in the last months of her life, and many in her immediate vicinity had hope for her future. However, she had covertly resumed using heroin behind the scenes. 2 weeks after Jimi Hendrix's passing, on October 4, 1970, Janis was discovered dead from an overdose in her Hollywood hotel room. She was just 27. Not only did she have a remarkable voice, but she was also one of the original members of the 27 Club, a sad group of talented musicians who died at the age of 27. Her death solidified her place in rock mythology. Following Hendrix, Morrison, Cobain, and Winehouse, Janis came to symbolize the awful cost of celebrity and the frailty that frequently accompanies genius. The public's interest in Janis's passing has grown to the point that it occasionally masks the complexity of her existence. She was not a stereotypical person. She was much more than a poor victim of the 1960s. She was an emotionally damaged yet shrewdly clever lady with much to say. It was her own words, in a manner other from anybody else's. The biggest irony is that Janis's most polished and emotionally complex record, Pearl, was the one she never survived to finish. It was published in 1971, a year later, and had memorable singles like Mercedes-Benz and Me and Bobby McGee, which conveyed the character's humor and mock fragility with heartbreaking clarity. Today, the record is regarded as one of the most important in rock history. A terrifying reminder of what might have been and what was lost. Ultimately, Janis Joplin devoted herself entirely to the music, even sacrificing herself for it. Her voice had been cut off much too quickly. However, the anguish, fervor, and strength she put into each note continued to speak to decades. The tomb of Bessie Smith. The blues wasn't the only genre that influenced Janis Joplin. They owned her. Bessie Smith, the renowned African-American performer regarded as the Empress of the Blues, stood out among her numerous inspirations. Janis was very moved by Bessie's music, which provided her with both emotional support and creative direction. Growing up in a traditional white community, where she was ostracized for being different, Janis identified with Bessie's unapologetic display of grief, suffering, and strength. She frequently referred to Smith as a spiritual ancestor as well as a role model, someone who allowed her to scream, grieve, and ache aloud. At one point, Janis said in passing that she thought she may be Bessie's reincarnation. Despite being apart by decades and ethnicity, their hardships were similar. Both were outsiders, both caused Melody heartache, and both had premature deaths in their life. When Janis discovered that Bessie Smith had been buried in 1937 without a headstone, her feeling of family grew even more intimate. A true smack in the face of the bigotry of the day. This blues artist passed away after being refused care at a Mississippi hospital only for white people. Despite all of her accomplishments and impact throughout the years, Bessie never got a fitting headstone. For Janis, it was an injustice rather than merely a mistake. What prevented one of the most influential voices in American music from being acknowledged? Anger rising within her, Janis did something about it. She and Juanita Green, who had known Bessie Smith personally and had previously worked for her, jointly funded a tombstone for Smith in 1970. Together, they ensured that Bessie would finally receive the respect she had long earned. Despite its simplicity, the tombstone's words, "The greatest blues singer in the world will never stop singing," struck a deep chord. There was much more than appreciation in that final remark. It was a declaration. According to Janis, Bessie's voice had endured beyond her physical body, echoing in the music, the conflict, and in every woman who dared to be outspoken, passionate, and unabashedly herself. Respecting Bessie's burial was an act of remembering and legacy in equal measure. It was more than simply thankfulness. Justice was at issue. Because Janis understood what it was like to be shunned and ridiculed, she refused to allow the world to bury Bessie in silence. She utilized her celebrity at that time to light the way for someone history had conspired to forget, rather than to further her own career. However, a real-life encounter with another so-called legend would leave Janis incensed and permanently altered, even though she paid respect to the memories of one blues star with dignity. The Lizard King's darker side. Jim Morrison has been a legendary character for decades, a combination of rock hero, poet, and tortured genius. However, new information is making historians and fans rethink the more sinister realities hidden behind the myth. Voices from Jim Morrison's inner circle discuss his unpredictable and even frightening conduct in the 2025 documentary series, Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison. Judy Huddleston is the most important of them, a former girlfriend who horrifyingly claims that Morrison took advantage of her sexually when they were dating. Her account presents a terrifying image of a guy whose delicate appeal may be quickly transformed into deadly fury. Huddleston claims that despite her frequent and unambiguous denial, Morrison allegedly locked her arms down and attacked her, claiming, "just went psycho." She described how Morrison's eyes became dark with rage, implies a guy engulfed in something even more harmful than carelessness driven by drugs. Huddleston and Morrison had a 4-year romance that started when she met him backstage at a show in the late 1960s. She discusses the emotional manipulation she endured in interviews and her biography, Love Him Madly, detailing how Morrison held her close while ever making a commitment to her. She hoped that she might transform him, ignorant of the toll it was having on their emotions. Her eventual revelation that what she had gone through was not romantic torture may have been the most sad. It was physical and sometimes psychological assault. Morrison's volatility was one of the things that many people found attractive about him. However, beneath the stage presence and poetic mystery came a guy who by many accounts used intimidation and terror to exert authority. Numerous more incidents of violence against women who were close to Morrison have occurred. Another figure from the 1960s rock movement, Pamela DeBarris, remembers Morrison striking her across the face at Whiskey A Go-Go without cause. The Doors drummer John Densmore, who is frequently regarded as Morrison's closest musical collaborator, remembered seeing Morrison seize a woman's arms and hold a knife to her. The new cultural conversation about power and responsibility gives these long-ignored tales, which were either romanticized or written off as simple examples of rock and roll excess, a far heavier weight. It appears that Morrison's devastation has hurt more than just him. It caused serious harm to others in his path, particularly ladies in his social circle. Perhaps these testimonies are even more horrifying in light of the additional information about these occurrences. In light of what we now know, they rewrite every earlier chapter, including Morrison's notorious relationship with Janis. Evidently, the fight between Morrison and Joplin has been portrayed for far too long as a wild whiskey-fueled celebrity story, about two titans clashing in a whirlpool of passion and ego. It's seen from a different angle now. According to some, Janis used a bottle of Southern Comfort in self-defense rather than diva theater in response to Morrison's aggressive attempts. The brutality she experienced was not an isolated incident. It was a component of an unsettling trend that is just now being recognized. Morrison could continue to be a symbol of the 1960s rebellious culture. He leaves behind a legacy that is considerably more dangerous and worrisome than the romanticized myth ever implied. The initial encounter. It had the beginnings of a rock and roll fairy tale, or at least one that a Hollywood producer would have imagined. Paul Rothchild, the renowned music producer who collaborated with Janis Joplin and the Doors, recognized a chance. The thought of presenting Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin, the so-called king and queen of rock, enthralled him. Rothchild imagined an exciting relationship between the two, who were both strong magnetic forces in the counterculture cosmos. So he set up a gathering in Hidden Hills, a location that is both near enough to draw the ideal amount of wild energy and far enough away from the bustle of Los Angeles to feel secluded. Jim and Janis both showed up sober, which was unusual for them both at the time. It appeared to be magic at first. Jim described Janis as amazing and was instantly captivated by her. Janis was also captivated by his appearance, his confidence, and his notoriety. They laughed together, talked to one another, and seemed really interested in each other. However, the spark failed to ignite enthusiasm in a society where instability is the norm. A fuse was lighted. Morrison's notorious drinking habit finally caught up with him as the evening went on. The first infatuation soon went sour. Known for drinking himself into intoxication, Jim started to change into the version of himself that even his best buddy found intolerable. Rothschild, who had witnessed this conduct several times, subsequently characterized Morrison's change from a delightful man to a repulsive alcoholic and cretin. However, Janis was a different type of drinker. Yes, she was capable of becoming boisterous, but her brand of drunkenness was kind, charming, and even charming to those around her. Janis seemed to be growing increasingly uneasy as Jim's blatantly crass conduct intensified and his approaches became more daring. In fact, it appeared like Jim would go forward more as she attempted to retreat, as though he enjoyed the refusal and it were all a part of some absurd game. The man behind the whole hoax, Rothschild, soon saw that the chemistry he had assumed would be legendary was turning into something sinister and perilous. Any promise that could have been between the two had turned sour by the time they left the party. Janis was fed up. She went to Rothschild and informed him that she was departing in the station wagon, the well-known band type she usually drove, and which had become into her makeshift haven. Morrison stumbled over, obviously not ready to accept that the night was ended, just as they were about to pull away. In a frantic and inebriated lunge, he grabbed a handful of Janis's hair as he reached into the car, slurring and belligerent. The final straw was that Janis went for the closest object, in this case a bottle of Southern Comfort, and brought it smashing on his skull without even pausing. When the glass broke, Morrison fell to the ground, unconscious. Bleeding and humiliated, the Lizard King lay in a fog. For Janis, it was a brief, magnificent moment of clarity amid a poisoned night. There is no louder message. No one had conquered her. Producer Paul Rothschild threw an unpleasant party, but it swiftly descended into one of the most heated personal altercations in rock history. Rothschild had invited Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin to a party in Hidden Hills, Los Angeles, with the intention of mediating a meeting between two of the most alluring personalities in the music industry. The first encounter between the king and queen of psychedelic rock sounded epic on paper. However, Morrison's darker side quickly surfaced as the whiskey's Southern Comfort began to flow. Morrison, who was well known for his aggressive demeanor and excessive drinking, wasn't only trying to get close to Janis. With all the delicacy of a wrecking ball, he was chasing her. When things started to go south, Janis, who was already cautious, attempted to flee. In a final desperate and violent effort, Morrison grabbed a fistful of her hair and pulled her back toward him like a drunken caveman as she climbed into her band's station wagon. Never one to be intimidated or subdued, Janis Joplin grabbed for the closest object at hand, a glass bottle of Southern Comfort, her constant stage partner. With the ferocity of someone who has had enough, she turned. The bottle was shattered over Morrison's head. Morrison fell, the glass broke, and the astonished bystanders were left gaping at the aftermath. This was no quarrel on a tour bus or in a barroom. It was an unvarnished, colorful act of defiance. Janis sat behind the wheel of her escape car, unrepentantly stubborn. As Jim lay either comatose or bewildered, depending on who is telling the tale. The incident meant more to Janis than simply turning down an unwelcome suitor. It was an instinctive proclamation. She wouldn't be hauled about like some backstage groupie, frightened or controlled. Perhaps more troubling was the fact that Morrison never seemed to grasp the significance of what had just happened. Rothschild claims that Jim arrived to rehearsals the following day, still requesting Janis's phone number, praising her, and stating that she was amazing. That combined adoration and illusion in this complex manner. He saw the altercation as merely another chapter in his lifelong tale of struggle and power struggles, rather than the conclusion of a fruitless interaction. But Janis's judgment was that night, and she made no secret of her contempt for Morrison after that. Although she never discussed it much in public, her close friends were well aware of her emotions. To her, the bottle was more than simply glass. It served as a border, and she made sure Morrison would be aware of it when he passed it. Some claim that Janis felt compelled to physically push Morrison more than once during the Hidden Hills party. The Scene nightclub in Manhattan is the site of another purported occurrence of a more rock mythology kind. Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, and Janis somehow ended themselves in a crazy situation. Witnesses said that Morrison, who has a tendency to act up on stage, started doing so throughout Hendrix's performance. causing Janis to break out once more in front of an amazed crowd, striking Morrison with a bottle and then dousing him with her drink. According to reports, the three of them got trapped together on the dance floor in a whirling wilderness composed of feathers, perspiration and shattered glass. A scene so wild and strange that it may have been taken from out of a fever dream using psychedelics. The reasons she hated Jim Morrison. It wasn't simply a bad moment in a crazy decade when Jim Morrison grabbed Janis Joplin by the hair and hit her head with a broken bottle of Southern Comfort. In the sand it was a distinguishing line. Janis made it plain to her friends and associates that she had no intention of continuing to work with Morrison after that. She had previously thought the man fascinating, even thrilling, but now he had shown her a side of himself that she didn't like. She didn't simply leave the party feeling angry and hurt, she left with a decision. She saw Morrison as more than just another artist lost in excess. He was a violent, conceited man who embodied the most poisonous masculine conduct Janis had endured throughout her life. Janis took the incident personally and irrevocably, even though many others in their orbit could have dismissed it as rock and roll drama. More than anything, she refused to forget him. She also refused to work with him and interact with him. Morrison wasn't simply another violent criminal. Janis was devastated by what he represented in the broader context of rock popularity in the 1960s. Jim represented the ideal of the self-destructive male artist to Janis, and his demise was of course very romantic, not to mention a tribute to his talent. She was all too familiar with the part, but she was never fortunate enough to perform it. She did not have the cultural freedom to be decadent as Morrison did. Due to her drinking and drug usage, Janis was not selected herself, and her skill was openly derided. The unfairness of Morrison's disarray infuriated her, even if it was acknowledged as a form of unadulterated creative talent. She believed that Morrison was more than just a predator. He strode forward, as a representation of the very male privilege and hypocrisy that had consistently pushed women like her off the stage, despite the fact that they were more talented than most men overall. However, despite being betrayed, rejected and angry, Janis remained. She turned everything into something remarkable, a life of achievement and sorrow. The legacy of Janis Joplin extends beyond her vocals. It is based on the sincere emotions she put into each performance, each phrase, and each scream that emanated from her innermost being. She wasn't technically flawless when she sang. Something more human, something unadulterated. She didn't require spectacular gloss or flawless control. She possessed a booming shout that could take a room by storm, as well as soul, wrath and vulnerability. Janis didn't simply sing songs, she lived them, whether she was crying through Little Girl Blue or ripping through A Piece of My Heart. Janis dared to be loud, dirty and authentic during a time when many women were advised to remain tiny and sweet. She turned into a conduit for suffering, not just her own but the sorrow of all those who had ever felt ignored, unloved or unmon. 50 years after her passing, Janis Joplin remains a cultural and musical titan, not only because of her skill but also because she dared to be herself in a society that tried to deny her any value. Yes, someone who serves as a warning that even the most resilient people may be crushed by fame. She is the human embodiment of the anthem. Her existence serves as a warning about the price of unresolved anguish and unfulfilled emotional hunger. However, by her scream and defiance, she further exalts the virtue of being authentic.